Hi, Smarter News. Big news from Facebook today on former President Trump and his ability to access their social media platforms. But this story is so much bigger than one person. So I wanted to take a moment and just walk through what actually took place and why it matters, because there's going to be a lot of noise about the politics at play here. But it's not so much about the politics. This story is about the precedent that Facebook is setting when we're talking about freedom of expression, free speech, and how we're able to communicate with each other. Who defines that for us now and for future generations? So let me give you a little bit of a backstory of how we even arrived at this point, and then we'll talk more broadly about why it matters. As you will recall, back at the beginning of January, where we had a riot on Capitol Hill, President Trump was suspended from Facebook and Instagram because of remarks that he said or he wrote at the time. That suspension by Facebook led to an indefinite suspension. So they did not take down all of the content that Mr. Trump had put up, but they had prevented him from going back to the platform itself. Now, they had the reasons at the time that they felt that the president was threatening this basically safety and security, that he posed a threat. And that's how Facebook has maintained its justification for taking President Trump essentially off the platform. Now, what Facebook has done is developed a board called the Oversight Board. And this is new. So if you haven't heard about this before, we all had to learn a lot about this over the last several days. The Oversight Board was created by Facebook to be independent. Yes, it's funded by Facebook money. And yes, the people that are on it are placed there by Facebook. Facebook likes to describe it as their Supreme Court. Other journalists have used it in that way as well. That doesn't exactly work. We'll explain why. But the idea is that there's going to be high profile content that this board is going to review. If Facebook makes a decision about that content, about restricting it or blocking it or any of it, and the Oversight Board will have the final say. What the Oversight Board says on an issue is binding. So Facebook actually has to follow it. And over the last several months, we've seen this board make some decisions on less high profile stories that have gone against the decisions made by Facebook. And in some ways, that's a way to say, hey, this advisory board, this independent governing body is actually independent of the executives at Facebook because they're making decisions that we ourselves didn't make. So how are these decisions made? Who's on this panel? This panel is put together by there's a lot of different experts from different fields. They include a lot of lawyers, a lot of folks that have been focused on human rights, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, a wide variety of people from all over the world. You know, if you look at the 20 people that sit in this governing body right now, if you looked at their descriptions, you know, if we were all at a cocktail party, you might think that they probably all hang out together. Doesn't mean they're not diverse, but they share some things in common, which is this value that Facebook is placing on human rights, freedom of expression, and the like. So this governing body could go up to 40 members or as few as 11. Right now, there's 20. And what happens if there's an issue, let's say I did something that's being reviewed by the board, and the board can really review quite a bit. It's a kind of an appeal process that gets to the board. 5 people from this governing body will review that specific case. So 5 people looked at this case regarding President Trump. Those 5 people, those panelists, then make a recommendation to the board. The board has to stand behind that decision, and then they put out a release. They actually put out a written statement explaining their decisions. So again, based on the reporting on this board, which is a little opaque still, exactly how these folks are compensated, what that looks like. It seems that they are compensated by Facebook. Facebook had this endowment, apparently. It's like a big chunk of money that they put in some other people's hands called trustees that are supposed to manage it and support this board in some way. So there is compensation attached. And yes, it is tethered to Facebook. It was developed by Facebook. So unlike the Supreme Court, where you have different elected officials, different elected presidents at various times put forward their appointees to the Supreme Court, and then the Senate looks at it, and we go through a hearing process. The Facebook executives haven't changed. Those aren't elected people, right? Those are the people that are in charge of the company. And so they're making these calls. And eventually there seems to be this idea that maybe there would be some sort of peer referral process where Facebook would not be as involved as who's placed on the board. But right now, that's not necessarily the case. The board is brand new. So what did the board say? What did the board say about President Trump specifically? Basically, the board said Facebook was justified in taking President Trump off the platform in the moment in January. What the board is saying, though, is that this indefinite suspension is not appropriate and doesn't actually follow Facebook's standards, because Facebook's normal penalties don't involve indefinite suspension. So this is what the board says. Mr. Trump created an environment where a serious risk of violence was possible. At the time of Mr. Trump's post, there was a clear immediate risk of harm, and his words of support for those involved in the riots legitimized their violent actions. That's key here. Facebook was justified in suspending Mr. Trump's account on January 6th and extending that suspension on January 7th. However, it was not appropriate for Facebook to impose an indefinite suspension, and they're saying that Facebook has to basically look at that decision within a 6-month period and make a decision once and for all. Can former President Trump be back on the platform or not? Now, let's just take that and put that aside. There's a lot of different opinions about what former President Trump did, whether or not what Facebook is doing now is appropriate. But what I want to do is take a big step back and think about, well, why does this really matter? We have to recall, and by the way, isn't the irony of that I'm talking to you on a Facebook platform is not lost on me. Just so we're clear, right? We all use Facebook a lot, and this is why this is key to this story. Facebook right now has approximately 3 billion users. Instagram has more than 1 billion. You're talking about an entity that's larger than any nation on the planet. Basically, a third of the planet is on these platforms. Think about that, because there's part of the planet, we're talking about people on the planet that are super young and super old that don't have access. But of the adults or the young people that have access to Facebook, a majority of us are on it. Facebook owns Instagram. So we're talking about this huge entity that has a lot of power. And you and I probably define freedom of speech, freedom of expression based on what we think are our rights based on being Americans, right? Like we think we have an idea of what that looks like. But Facebook is really defining what that looks like on a platform that's much bigger than the United States. And it's doing it in a way that is new and different, and there'll be a lot of different debate about. The reason why it's important not just to focus on President Trump in this case is just to get an understanding of the access that Facebook has to a wide group of people, and really ask ourselves, what does that look like now and for future generations? What sort of power does Facebook wield in this particular case? And is that appropriate? I was speaking to a colleague today. She brought up a great point. Part of this issue with Facebook is that there's no way for me to take any recourse. If Facebook decided to take me off right now, I can't sue Facebook. If they decide Smarter News is not appropriate, they could just take me off. And by the way, that's my agreement for working with this private company. I'm not paying anything to be on this platform. It's free. They're allowing me, but I'm agreeing to their what it takes to actually use the platform. So the question then becomes, how do they define who's on it? And if there's no recourse for any of us to approach Facebook other than this very, very thin path that may lead to this oversight board, what does that mean for the power of open debate, open discussion, and what we value? How does that challenge some of the pillars in American society? But really, what we're talking about is how are we defining it for us as a global community? I know that's kind of like a weighted political term, but in ways we're really talking about, what does that mean? So I'm curious what you think about this because of the ramifications. We'll see. This is sort of kicking the ball down the road when it comes to President Trump. We'll see what happens if Facebook decides to let him back on, or what sort of obligations he'll have to make to be allowed to be back on. And the question then becomes too is who's actually giving Facebook power? If we all decide that no one's ever going to use Facebook again, they don't have any power. But the likelihood of that is very little. My colleague, what she was saying to me, she has a great legal background, and she said, this is a really good example of what happens when Congress doesn't act. Because if there were different laws, that means that we could challenge Facebook. For example, if we decided that our content should stay up, then we'd have a way to talk to them. But right now, we don't have a way to. There's no way for President Trump to sue Facebook or sue Instagram. It's not allowed based on current existing law. That could change if Congress would make new laws if they deem that appropriate. There's been all these conversations over the last several years, I'm sure you've seen this, about whether social media platforms are actually monopolies. If they basically have stamped out all competitors that can really challenge or diversify this industry. Would this be allowed if they were a railroad, right? Would that be allowed? What would that look like? So these are some really big questions that we're confronting now. And with this new oversight board, we're seeing something different in this monolith of social media company that is allowing so many of us to communicate, so many of us to do business, and so positive in so many ways, but also is leading to some really big questions about what we're willing to follow for the price of participation. And what does that sliding path sort of look like, not just for us, but for our children, especially as these platforms grow to be so enormous. So I'm really curious your thoughts on this overall. Just a personal note, some of you know back in January, I was having huge problems with our Instagram account. I was getting kicked off, blocked all the time. I couldn't, you can't talk to anybody. So I was very worried. And sometimes as a business owner, you have to make decisions, This is one of the reasons why I developed a newsletter for the weekend so that we can keep in touch through a newsletter. This is why we invested in a new website. People are like, why are you investing in a new website? You have social media. But this is one of the reasons why. I'll give you a great, very, it's just sort of a silly example. I really felt the gravity of the situation. I worked on a story for you about COVID-19. It was right in the kind of the height of this really stressful moment for all of us. And there was this amazing new research about how dogs can sniff out COVID-19. And I thought, this is great. This is going to be such a great story. I'm going to share this with our audience on a Friday. Like, we need something that's hopeful and shows us how amazing some of the research is, and that there might be a lot of different ways that we're going to be able to keep each other safe during this pandemic. And who would have thought that dogs would be it? So I was really excited about putting up this story for you. As soon as I put it up, it's covered with CDC warnings from Instagram. And that's when it all hit me, because this story was not a big deal. It wasn't a political debate. You know me, I'm fact-based and trying to give you guys a nonpartisan perspective on so many different stories. And for this kind of silly, fun story to be manipulated by the platform, and yes, a platform I'm agreeing to use, made me really concerned, because if it's for a silly story, what happens when it's for a really important one that we really need to show both sides, that have life or death ramifications? So I have a lot of mixed feelings about social media. I love it because I can connect with you. And I love it that we can talk live. It's just amazing. It's amazing. I love Instagram. I like all of it. The recipes, the bikini shots, all the stuff, all the fluff. And I also like it as a way to access people as a journalist, because you can hear directly from them. It's one of the great things about social media that just wasn't available to journalists in previous generations. It's huge. It's huge. So I'm grateful. But I'm also curious about what this looks like, what precedent this decision sets for the future, and what this all looks like several years from now. For those that may have a strong negative feeling about former President Trump, you may think this is no big deal. But I think anytime you're reading these headlines, just something to think about as you navigate this story. You'll see it on our website as well today. Take President Trump out of it. He invokes a very visceral reaction for those who love him and those who don't. Put someone in there that you really like, that you feel very passionate about, and think about how the situation would be different. Because at the end of the day, Facebook and their executives are making that decision about who's appropriate and what's appropriate. And it's their right as business owners to do so. The question is, when the platform is so large and has such a large impact, who defines what's fair is a really big question, and one that we're going to have to confront. Not just today, but for weeks and months and years to come. So curious your thoughts, and please check out our story. We're going to put it on social media. Yes, we are. Because if this is where you are, if this is the highway you're driving on, I want to meet you where you are. But we'll also have all of our content on smarternews.com. And that's a way you can connect with us, and you don't have to navigate any comments or anything like that. And you could just see the news, read it for what it is, and get on with your life, which is what we hope to do for you. Lighten the load when it comes to news delivery and news consumption. All right, guys, that's all I have for now. More on this later. And thanks so much for your support of smarternews.com and making this dream a reality. I appreciate you so much. Have a great day.